beyond just falling in love and hope that that will carry you forever. Because it doesn't. If any of you are newly married, I'm sorry to just like crush your dreams in like 30 seconds here. Welcome. But I remember realizing one day that while I was a very earnest young man, I was very passionate about loving my wife, I had absolutely no idea what that was supposed to look like or how to do it. Not a clue. Movies, books, TV, they're constantly proclaiming marriage like it's the newest fad. Like, get it while it's hot, everybody. And then they just welcome you to move on as soon as you're bored with it. And I knew that wasn't what I wanted to have. I knew that was garbage. I wanted to reclaim what marriage means, but I didn't actually know where to start. I knew that what I was being shown was stupid, but I didn't have any real idea of what to replace it with. And our friends weren't any help either at the time. See, a few other couples got married about the same time that Naomi and I did, but most of them had the intelligence to wait until they graduated. But those that did get married, they didn't have any more of a clue about what was going on or how to do it than we did. In fact, most of the people that got married about the same age that we did are divorced today. So it seems pretty clear that Naomi and I were not alone in our cluelessness. Looking back, I think one of the things that saved us is that as soon as we got married, we began intentionally seeking out more experienced married people to hang out with. We joined a church with people that had 10, 20, 40 years of marriage under our belts. Love those two. And we begged them to adopt us. And man, did it open our eyes. Because we saw what marriage could be as people invited us in to show us theirs. We learned what commitment looked like from one lady whose husband had died, and we didn't even realize it for the first 2 years of knowing her because he was still such a part of her life. I mean, she talked about him constantly, and it turns out that they'd only been married for 5 years, and she had been a widow for the next 40. But when she had committed her life to him, she meant it. She was still celebrating their anniversaries without him decades later. We learned what it looked like to support each other in the confidence and the beaming faces we saw another couple give each other whenever one of them stood up to say anything, because the other one just knew that this was going to be pure gold and everybody needed to hear this because they so believed in their partner. We learned what self-sacrifice in marriage looked like as we watched an old man marry the love of his life and care for her even when they knew that she had Alzheimer's. He sold his house to pay for a place for her to live where she could be cared for, even when she couldn't remember her new husband's name. And we learned what being stronger together meant as we watched the husband give the eulogy at their daughter's funeral, only able to stand upright because his wife was holding his hand quietly the entire time. It turns out that Naomi and I might have had all of the love in the world, but we didn't know where to point it. We didn't know what we should be stretching for until we saw it lived out in others. And none of these people were perfect. I mean, we saw instances of frustration and failure and abject stupidity in these people. One of the men that I learned the most from about being a supportive husband, in the end, cracked, and he could not bring himself to visit his wife in her last few weeks as she was dying of cancer. He wasn't perfect. He was deeply flawed. But that doesn't mean that what I learned from him is any less significant. because he still showed me how a spouse can blossom and begin to believe in themselves when you believe in them first. Each and every person, each and every situation, flawed and broken as they were, gave me a glimpse of something more. I mean, they widened my view. They filled in the picture for me of what marriage is supposed to be. And each moment stretched my definition and my ideas and forced me to encompass something wider, something better into my life that I didn't have before. Like pieces of a puzzle coming together to show me something far better than anything I could have created on my own. In the Gospel of Luke, good segue, I know, I'm smooth. There's a great story of another clueless young man who comes to Jesus with the question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? After some back and forth, it's revealed that he needed to love God with everything he had and love his neighbor as himself. And the man goes, and who's that? What does that look like? And quite frankly, that's a question I share. Maybe I shouldn't because I am a pastor, but this isn't my congregation, so I can admit it. I don't have a clue what that's supposed to look like. And even if I widen my definition of neighbor as far as I can imagine, I still struggle with understanding what that looks like. Especially as 1 John says we love because Jesus first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he is a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And he has given us this command, whoever loves God must also love his brother. We are to be like Christ, and loving our neighbor is mandatory. We can't claim to love God without it, but that still doesn't answer the question of what loving your neighbor is supposed to mean. Because left to my own devices, I will redefine love and I will redefine neighbor until whatever I'm already doing meets that definition. Some of you think I'm joking, but I have literally waved good morning at my neighbor across the fence and thought, way to show love, Brian. You can check human interaction off the list for the day and walked back inside. True story. Introverts of the world unite separately. Not together. And granted, that is not me at my best. It's close, but it's not me at my best. But even at my best, my definitions of love and neighbor, of what it means to be like Jesus in my world, are unclear and weak and small. Like my definition of love and marriage were when I first married Naomi. All the drive in the world and no real clue what it's supposed to look like. But fortunately, we have Halloween to show us Jesus. What? Okay, not exactly what you were expecting. Okay, well, Halloween gets a bad rap in Christian circles. It's so bad that we forget that it is a Christian holiday. Yeah, so you're like, what? No. Here's how it goes. So Halloween comes from Hallows Eve, since "een" is a diminutive suffix in English. Ooh, grammar! So, meaning to come before, or Hallows Eve. Hallow is another word for holy, or as we call a holy person, a saint. Saint's Eve, entering All Saints' Day. Halloween today might be the day that we see close up what goblins, ghosts, and 7-year-old Iron Men look like. But All Saints' Day is meant to be the day that we see up close what Jesus looks like. One of the most beautiful things about Christianity is how we are connected through Christ to people of all rations, yeah, okay. If you're on the Atkins diet, you are. If you're on the keto, no. Nations, not rations. That would make more sense. Just cross that word out. Okay. Preaching manuscript only works if you have spell check. That's the lesson that everybody learns today. No, but it is beautiful because we are connected to all races. Let's see if I get it this time. Nations, woo, and times. And some people stand out as particularly Christ-like. And it's not that we think that these people are perfect. It's not that we worship them. It's not anything like them. We can look at them and say, wow, you are a messed up human being. But in this, I see Christ. And once a year, we have a chance to admit that we really don't have a good picture of what Christ in us is supposed to look like in this world. We don't really have a good idea of what our neighbor looks like or how to love them. But in some people, we get just a piece, just a glimmer of what Jesus in us looks like, and our vision of the world expands. That's All Saints' Day. So today I want to reclaim this holy day, which just the fact that I called it a holy day makes some of you go, ugh, in your chair just a little bit there. But I want to try and reclaim it to make All Hallows Eve maybe a little more hallowed again. And I want to do this by opening up some of what is going on in my head on a daily basis, which, good luck. But what's going on when I wave at a neighbor and I think that somehow that means that I'm loving them like Jesus? Because as much as I want to believe that that's all I need to do, God almost invariably brings to my mind the story of someone like Perpetua. Perpetua was a 22-year-old North African woman, a young wife with a brand new baby boy, and was a brand new Christian. But this was 203 AD. And during a crackdown on Christians, most of her house church was arrested. She could have slunk away, but instead she and another woman named Felicitas turned themselves in because they refused to be separated from the people who had connected them to Christ. They were thrown literally in a deep, dark pit and left to rot. Her father came and begged her to recant. The judge begged her to just offer sacrifices, just bless the emperor and save herself, but just for her son's sake, do it. She wouldn't. So she and her entire church were sentenced to death in the arena on the emperor's birthday. The situation was miserable, but they made the best of it. Perpetua was baptized in that prison. And they spent their time witnessing to the guards and telling them to remember their faces among all of those who are going to be executed, because how they died would show the guards the truth about the God that they served. Yeah, I'm probably going to cry, but if liquid coming out of a guy's eyes is a problem, deal with it. They entered the arena singing hymns. And there, a bull gored her quite badly. But it didn't kill her, and she was brought back in. Where she and the other Christians spent their time comforting the horrified guards, saying goodbye. And I'm quoting, "Remember me and remember the faith. These things should not disturb you, but rather strengthen you, because we go to be with our Lord." Perpetua was led back into the arena to be executed. And again, quoting, "So the martyrs got up and went to the spot of their own accord, as the people wanted them to. And kissing one another, they sealed their martyrdom with a ritual kiss of peace. But the guard that was supposed to execute her was shaking so badly that he botched her execution on the first hit. And not thinking about herself, but about the man who was about to kill her, she guided his knife to her own throat so he could do his job without being punished." I look at her story and I see so much. I am comforted by Christ. I'm confronted by Christ standing up for her brothers and sisters. I see Christ comforting even her executioner neighbor. But that's asking too much, I think. My mind starts reeling. Okay, nope. Start coming up with reasons why I don't have to be like her. But she's a martyr. She's a martyr, I think. They're all half crazy. They're practically begging to die. That's the problem. That's why I don't have to, because that sort of love surely isn't expected for normal people who want to live. But then what about the Bishop Chrysostom? 200 years later, head over the church in Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire at the time. Cathedrals were being built. Money and power was flowing into the church. And he stood against the empress and spoke about giving to the poor. He spoke about the dangers of excess. He spoke about the dangers of greed and of wealth, and he was exiled for it. He came back a few years later. He preached the same thing, and he was exiled again. Time and again, he came back, preached the truth, and was kicked back out of his city. But he refused to be silent until the day he died far from home. And I look at him, a man sacrificing everything, and I am confronted by Christ speaking out for his poor neighbor. Fine. I think, okay, he lived, but he was a man of power, and I don't have much power, so that obviously can't apply to me. Except that there are people like Brother Lawrence, a poor monk from the 1600s. When monasteries were known as places of wealth and the church was a means to power. And yet in that era, Lawrence was a dishwasher. He spent his life scrubbing pots and pans in the back of the monastery. He never advanced beyond that, and he never wanted to. Instead, he just humbly served. And we only remember him today through the letters that people sent him asking him, how do you do what you do? Because Brother Lawrence was known for how he practiced to truly pray without ceasing, 24 hours a day, as long as he's awake in communion with God. To always be alive in the knowledge and presence of Jesus. He needed no fame. He needed no power beyond God's presence. And we remember him today because the book of those letters, the practice of the presence of God, is the third most read Christian work of all time. And I believe 9th of all works of all time. And in him I see Christ humbly serving his prideful neighbor. And we don't remember anything about anybody who is seeking power with him. Brother Lawrence's story is harder for me to shake, but I can still find excuses because I always can find excuses. I'm pretty good at that, actually. See how long the trash hasn't been taken out. But Brother Lawrence was still a monk. He still got to live in a secluded monastery all his life, right? I've got 2 small kids. I would gladly wash dishes for peace and quiet like that. That is why he could do that, I swear. But instead, I think, I have to live in the real world with pain and trouble. Such idealism can't possibly work in the brokenness around me. And I can cling to that lie until I'm confronted by people like Sojourner Truth, a woman born into slavery in the early 1800s. She knew the pain that living in the real world can cause. She was sold 4 times. She was beaten. She watched the love of her life be killed because they were together. A few years after she managed finally to escape being forced to leave several of her children in slavery, she felt called to preach. And preach she did. She spent the rest of her life speaking out as an abolitionist and a woman's rights advocate, often while being threatened, jeered, and booed at. But she kept at it, trying to convince people who had once owned her and her children that she was worthy of respect and of rights. And when asked once why she did it, how she did it, Sojourner said that her faith gave her the ability to love everyone, and this is one of my favorite quotes of all time, that Jesus had overcome her hatred of white people. Don't blame her at all on that one. And in her I see Christ, broken, reaching out to the racist, abusive neighbor. Or there's Brother Damien. Damien was a young man from Europe who went on a mission to Hawaii back in the day when Hawaii was still a sovereign nation with its own king and kingdom. There he worked among some of the poorest people, many of them lepers, until the king of Hawaii ordered a forced evacuation of all lepers to a tiny little peninsula on a deserted, remote island off on the side of the chain. Thousands of people shipped off and basically left to die with nothing. Damien volunteered to go too. He lived outside, no house. He never found time to build one. He kept making houses for others. He got to right to work. He planted trees. He dug wells. He got them water. He built houses. He dug graves. In the end, he built over 1,200 coffins with his own hands. He washed the lepers' bodies. He bandaged their wounds. He fed them. He ate with them. He hugged them, and he lived with them until one day he began his sermon with, "We lepers." He had become one of them. He died at the age of 49, having transformed that peninsula. And some of his last words were these, written to his brother: "I am gently going to my grave. It is the will of God, and I thank him very much for letting me die of the same disease and in the same way as my lepers. I am very satisfied and very happy." I see Christ living with his outcast neighbor. But wait, my mind says, none of these can count because they're all priests, they're all monks, and I'm a really crappy bivocational pastor, and there's obviously a different class of Christian going on here. Except Corrie ten Boom wasn't. As a girl from Holland, her family sheltered Jews in World War II. Eventually, they were found out, and her sister ended up in a German labor camp where they both suffered greatly, and eventually her sister died. After the war, she organized a home for survivors of the Holocaust. Eventually, she returned to Germany to preach the need for forgiveness. And after one speech, a man came up to her that she recognized as one of the guards who had stripped her down and made her parade naked in front of them in the camp that her sister had never left. And the guard stuck out his hand and asked for forgiveness. What do you do with that? This is her own words. It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out. But to me, it seemed hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I had ever had to do. For I had to do it. I knew that. The message that God forgives has a prior condition, that we forgive those who have injured us. If you don't forgive men their trespasses, Jesus says, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. And yet I stood there with this coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Jesus, help me, I prayed silently. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me, and as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands, and then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried with all my heart. I am forced to witness in her life glimpses about how Christ forgives even her Nazi neighbor. And at this point, my defenses usually begin crumbling. that there is more to loving like Christ than I have been living. There is more to who my neighbor is than I want to admit, that God's vision is bigger and grander, more painful and more amazing than what I can hold on to and what I can control. But a part of me is also lazy and still fights to stay unmoving in my selfishness. These people all happened quite a while ago. Maybe their stories are exaggerated. Maybe God just worked more strongly then. Today, I try to convince myself we're all just people waving at our neighbors as an act of love and feeling proud when we only cuss out that idiot driver in our heads and not in front of the kids. Right? We're nothing more. Struck a little close to home on some of you there. Except that Fareed exists. Fareed is a Christian born and raised in Syria and he got caught up in the civil war that's currently destroying his country. Suddenly being a Christian became punishable by death. Every terrorist cell, every rebel group were competing with each other to find and kill Christians, often in the most horrible manner they could come up with, to gain their wealth and to cleanse their country. As their war raged on, more and more Christians fled the country. Estimates from 2016 are that 13.5 million Syrians have fled their country. That's over half their population, not counting the hundreds of thousands who have died. Fareed and his little house church, they met together at the beginning of this to decide what to do. They prayed for a week. And then they met back up in secret, and they realized that each person individually, God had pressed on their heart that each of the dozen of them needed to stay. That God wanted them to remain in Syria even if it meant their deaths. So they bought a plot of land together to be their graveyard. They made a pact that as each of them is finally caught and murdered for their faith, they would bury one another there. This is what Fareed had to say. I used to think I lived a life of sacrifice, but that changed when the war broke out. Although Syria has so few believers that there was danger before, I did not know what it means to sacrifice. What I thought was sacrifice was actually just inconvenience. Once we bought the graveyard, we gave up our right to live as we pleased. We consigned ourselves to a violent death, whether a sudden bullet in the brain, beheading, or a torturous crucifixion. Our lives rest in God's hands. There is remarkable freedom in having no expectations, no plans for tomorrow. The question I and many others start every day with is this: Jesus, what do you have planned for me and my family? Only today matters. Only how I live for Jesus counts. Everything else is superficial. When I hand over my life to the Lord, knowing each day may be my last one on this earth, I am more at peace than ever before. Christ still loves his terrorist neighbor. And I am left without excuses. But a strange thing happens then. Because if my expectation becomes that Christ is at work in those around me, that there is more to loving my neighbor and being like Christ than I am currently doing, then I start looking for glimpses of Jesus in those around me, and I see them. I mean, even in my little church, I see them. I see Jesus at work in the woman who tirelessly gives away tens of thousands of pieces of clothing, even though she's on a fixed income and is struggling to look after her grandchildren and her sick son. I see Jesus in the people who have donated cars that they needed to sell, who have invited people into their homes when they had no place else to be, who volunteered to look after a dying friend because there was no one else to be with them. I can see it here too. Even though I'm not here often, I have seen some and I have heard of far more. I have heard of people giving their money when they didn't have any. sacrificing time and energy when they're nearly burned out, people who give, people who love and serve when they have every right to be broken. That's loving your neighbor too. That's Christ-like. That is what I come to church to see. In this life, Satan will do everything possible to convince us that if something isn't perfect, then it isn't worth having. And we throw away fruit if there's a bruise. Grocery stores aren't allowed to sell vegetables if they aren't pretty. It's one of the most bizarre things I think I've ever learned. But it's tempting to throw out All Saints' Day because it has been tainted by Halloween. And it's tempting to throw the church out too as soon as we recognize how broken it can be. There are flaws, we think. Whew. We're better off alone. It's never true. We're only perfect alone because we change the definitions of love and neighbor until what we're already doing meets them. We need the brokenness of each other, of the saints before us, the saints around us, to truly understand and see Jesus. Because the important question about community should never be, is it perfect? But can we see Jesus better because of it? And for me, the answer is yes. Yes, I see Jesus better when I look in the flawed faces of those around me. I know what love looks like better by watching them. That's why I'm still in church. There are so many flaws in our churches, and there is not much perfection, but there is a lot of Christ. And I cannot see Jesus as well without them. And I cannot see Jesus as well without those that we carry with us. So to all the saints, I say Happy Saints' Day, and thank you.